Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Nathan and today we are continuing our series going over the core classes from the 2024 Player's Handbook. And in this video, we're going to be covering the Paladin class. Now the Paladin class is one of my absolute favorites. It was the first class I ever played back in 2010 when I first started, which was in 4th edition. And today we are also wearing the Paladin shirt, which says, I reserve the right to smite you. And smiting enemies has just been one of my, absolute things that brought me joy ever since I've been playing. So today we're going to be covering what is my favorite class. So here is our agenda. I'm going to be giving an overview of the class and talking what I believe the role of the core class to be. Now, importantly, in this video, I'm just going to be covering the core Paladin class and not any of the subclasses. I will kind of talk about the general gist of what their abilities do, but we're not going to be covering them in detail in this video, and we haven't done that in any of the videos in this series. Those are going to be reserved for subclass reviews later on. Now, after doing the class overview and role, we're going to talk about the class features from level 1 to level 20, and I've broken this out into 5 level sections to make it easier. After that, we'll talk a little bit about multiclassing the Paladin under the 2024 rules, and then I'll summarize and give the class some ratings as a whole and give a little bit more of a broad overview of how things have changed in this most recent update. So, first up, class overview and role. And the Paladin is a hybrid martial caster. They're the first that we've covered in this series that is a half caster, and they are both strength and charisma based. Now, the fantasy of the Paladin's power comes from swearing oaths. And a great example of this from fantasy is if you're a fan of Brandon Sanderson, like I am, the Knights Radiant in his Stormlight Archive series, the way that their powers work is you basically swear ideals, and as you swear more oaths, you go up in power. And so that's like a fantasy that can kind of jive with Paladins. But one of the key things about Paladins, Paladins don't have to be bound to a particular deity or god, although it can be very helpful for your RP to do so. Again, Paladin's power comes from their oaths, not necessarily from a deity. If I had to summarize their role in a single sentence, I would say the Paladin is they're a frontline durable damage dealer and support. They're also pretty much heavily incentivized to be melee. Now, Paladins typically want to be strength focused because of kind of the attribute and requirements of the class. However, a dex forward Paladin is more favorable under the 2024 rules than it was under the 2014 rules. And you can also potentially go charisma forward with a particular multi-class. Another interesting thing, one of the big things that makes Paladins want to be melee, Paladins a class exclusive spell group called Smites. Almost all of them require you to hit an enemy with a melee attack. You can actually make an Archer Paladin a lot better under the 2024 rules. I'm not going to cover that in detail in this video, but it is an option. However, especially as you get later on, there's a lot of conflicting things because a lot of Paladin features and spells want you to make melee attacks. So again, heavily incentivized to be melee. The Paladin is also another class that is naturally mad or multiple attribute dependent. And the base class has pretty much always faced this challenge in 5e. You basically have to choose between one stat for all of your attacks and another for your spells and some of your class features. You can, again, somewhat solve this with a few particular multi-classes, but for the most part, this is being multiple attribute dependent is always something that a Paladin is going to have to weigh and think about as they are progressing. All right, so here is the table of all of the class features for the Paladin under the 2024 rules, and the Paladin has actually seen quite a few changes. So first, up in green here, these are all things that are new. So Weapon Mastery is new, the Paladin Smite feature I'm going to say is new, the Faithful Steed feature is new, and Abjure Foes is new. Now, notably, there are a few things that were removed off of the list. So Divine Sense as a class feature was removed, however, it has been reworked into the Channel Divinity feature. Now, Divine Smite, that feature at level 2, you pump spell slots into just damage on hit, that has been replaced and kind of reworked into some of the Paladin spells, and we'll talk about that later. And then Divine Health, the feature that gave you disease immunity, has also been removed. And it seems like for the most part, a lot of diseases have been removed, either like out of the monster manual or out of the Dungeon Master's Guide. So I don't think that's necessarily a big deal to get rid of disease immunity. All right, and next up in blue here, these are all the things that have changed. So there's quite a few things that have changed here, as you can see on this list. Some of the things that have changed are minor. Some of them are going to be pretty major. And we'll talk about this more as we kind of go through all of the feature progression. All right, so moving on to our features at level 1. So first up, the things in the Paladins block. So the Paladin's primary abilities are Strength and Charisma. Now this isn't anything new. These are just the requirements that you need to be able to multi-class into or out of Paladin. You need at least 13 in either of these categories. Now remember, if you want to go with the kind of Dex dual wield thing, you don't actually need to meet the primary ability scores of your class if you're not going to multi-class. And you know, going Dex based dual wielder is actually a viable strategy on Paladins now, assuming you don't want to multi-class. The dice of a Paladin is a D10, and they're proficient in Wisdom and Charisma saving throws. They get 2 skills off the following list: Athletics, Insight, Intimidation, Medicine, Persuasion, and Religion. They are proficient with simple and martial weapons, which is all the weapons in the game. You don't get any tool proficiencies, and they're proficient with light armor, medium armor, heavy armor, and shields. And again, there are no changes here. Now, the Paladin is one of 3 classes in the game, the others being Cleric and Fighter, that can naturally get heavy armor proficiency at level 1. Now, the only class that can actually give you heavy armor proficiency with a multi-class is Cleric, but that's something that we can talk a little bit more about later. All right, so features at level 1. The first one that Paladins get is Lay on Hands. So though this is a pretty cool feature, it has been buffed actually in the 2024 rules. So you have a pool of Lay on Hands points equal to 5 times your Paladin level, and you get back all of these points on a long rest. Now as a bonus action, you can touch a creature, which can be you, and restore some amount of hit points up to the max amount you have left in your pool. So if you had 5, you could do 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 hit points. If you had 10, you could do any number in between, and when you use that many points, they get sucked out of the pool. So eventually a Paladin will have a pool of 100 points by level 20. You can almost think of this as 100 extra health the party or the Paladin has. Additionally, the Paladin can spend 5 points to remove the poisoned condition, and if you remove that condition in this way, you also don't heal them at the same time. It used to be able to remove poison or a disease, but again, diseases kind of seem to not be a thing, so I don't really see that as an issue here. Now, this used to take a full action, and so it being a bonus action is a big deal because now you can keep fighting, but you can also heal yourself at the same time. You could also heal yourself under the 2014 rules. It said you could touch a creature, and they just added this little thing in parentheses in the new handbook that says it can be you, just to make sure that's clear for everyone. The next feature that Paladins get at level 1 is spellcasting, and Paladins didn't used to get their spellcasting until level 2. So the fact that it comes at level 1 now is a big deal, not only for a pure class Paladin, but also potentially for multi-class Paladins. Their primary ability to cast their spells is their Charisma, which is potentially going to conflict with your weapon attacks. This is kind of one of the reasons why Paladin is a multiple attribute dependent class. They can use a holy symbol as their casting focus, and you get to prepare 2 spells, and you can replace 1 spell every time you take a long rest, and you have 2 first level slots at this point. Now, under the 2014 rules, the number of spells you could prepare was your Paladin level over 2, rounded down, plus your Charisma modifier. So with the progression that we saw in the chart, what this actually is going to result in is you're going to have generally fewer spells prepared in the earlier levels, but once you get up to level 5 and 6 or so, it's going to be about the same as it was before, depending on what your charisma was, so it's not really that big of a deal. The general gist of what's on the Paladin spell list: you have buffs both for yourself and allies. And they're usually kind of more defensive oriented ones, although some of them are offensive kind of weapon attack buffs. You have all of the Paladin Smite spells, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a little bit. And they also have some healing and kind of support spells on that list. There are also a few very specific control options and that kind of thing. And one of the things to think about, especially when evaluating Paladin subclasses, is what their spells, the subclass spells, can do that the main Paladin list does not have. All right. Paladins also get weapon masteries, much like all the martials in the 2024 Player's Handbook, and Paladins get 2. You don't get any additional ones as you level, but you can swap them out on a long rest. And, you know, between Lay on Hands, Spellcasting, and Masteries, all at level 1. Paladins get quite a few things here, and this can actually make them a pretty desirable dip class for this reason, assuming that your character meets their attribute requirements. All right, moving on to level 2, Paladins get their fighting style, and you can pick any fighting style feat that you want, or you can take this Blessed Warrior option, which gives you a couple of cantrips off the cleric list, and they'll use your charisma modifier. Now, one of the cool things here is this is wide open to every fighting style in the game. Under the 2014 rules, Paladins didn't have access to all the fighting styles. You could like things like archery and 2-weapon fighting were off limits before. This means that there's a lot of different ways that you can play a Paladin and use your fighting style that weren't available before. So this, again, opens you up to potentially do things like a dual wielder Paladin a lot easier, or potentially even an archer Paladin, although again, that has some conflicts with the way that Paladins are incentivized to be melee. Now, the next feature that we get here is Paladin Smite. And what this says is we have the Divine Smite spell always prepared, and we can cast it without spending a spell slot once per long rest. So the Divine Smite class feature has been cut and turned into a spell, and let's talk about this real quick. So, smites as spells. So all of the smite abilities are now Paladin class exclusive spells. And across the board, they require a bonus action to cast, and you can only cast them when you hit an enemy with an attack. Now, almost all of the attack requirements have to be a melee attack. I think there's maybe only one that isn't. Additionally, if a smite spell required concentration, they've been removed from almost every single one. I think the only one that requires concentration now, I think, is Banishing Smite. There might be one other one, but generally speaking, anything that has an enduring effect from a smite spell before doesn't usually require concentration anymore. And the general idea of this is you can trade the raw damage of the base Divine Smite spell for potentially other effects. Some subclasses out of other classes do get access to smite spells, so they're not exactly Paladin exclusive, but they are for the most part. Now, there are some big implications here. The first one is the fact that smites are spells, means they don't work when you have something that disables spell casting. For example, a barbarian's rage or a druid's wild shape. So before, under the 2014 rules, if you were a barbarian paladin, you could still divine smite during rage because while it was spending a spell slot, you weren't casting any spells. Or if you were like a moon druid who had a paladin dip, you could smite with your beast form attacks. Even though you can't cast spells as a druid in wild shape, you could still spend them with Divine Smite. However, given that smites are spells now, you can't do that anymore. Additionally, the fact that it's a bonus action means it's going to consume a little bit more of the Paladin's action economy. Under the 2014 rules, Paladins often wanted to find things to fill their action economy. Maybe something like Polearm Master or something to give yourself a reliable at-will bonus action, but with smites being spells now, as well as Lay on Hands being a bonus action, a paladin might have less use for that kind of thing. Now, the fact that it consumes a spell slot and is a bonus action means that you can, and this makes smiting a once per turn thing. You're not going to be able to do it on every single attack. So one of the things you could do under the 2014 rules, let's say you had a paladin, you multiclassed with fighter and got action surge. You could, if once you had extra attack, you could attack, and you could smite on every single one of those hits and burn through a lot of resources for spell slots. But you would be able to pump out a lot of damage. Now, one of the design goals that Wizards of the Coast had with the 2024 rules was to reduce burst damage, and making Divine Smite a once per turn thing definitely helps do that. Of the smite spells for damage, by the way, Searing Smite actually scales the best with upcasting. I think once you're past level 2 or 3 or so, it scales better than the base Divine Smite, unless you're using that against an enemy that that spell gets its bonus damage against, namely undeads or fiends. And we'll talk a little bit more about the smite being once per turn thing kind of throughout the video and towards the end. All right, moving on to level 3. Paladins get their Channel Divinity. and they get 2 uses per long rest and recharge 1 per short rest. Now, you used to only get 1 channel divinity per short rest, and so pretty much now you'll always have an extra use, because before you would recharge 1 on short rest, but you can only ever have 1. And so this makes channel divinity, generally speaking, a lot easier to use. Divine Sense has also been rolled into the channel divinity feature, so as a bonus action, look, another Paladin bonus action. So for the next 10 minutes or until you're incapacitated, you know the location of any celestials, fiends, and undead within 60 feet of you, and you know what they are. And you can also sense anything that was hallowed or desecrated, such as with the Hallow spell. This is more of a flavor thing option than anything. It used to be tied to your charisma modifier, but I think it generally works a little better with channel divinity. It makes a little more sense, and this can be a useful thing for RP, but I don't see you using it all that often unless it's in a very specific campaign. However, next at level 3, Paladins get their subclass, and there are 4 options presented in the 2024 Player's Handbook. We have the Oath of Devotion, the Oath of Glory, the Oath of Ancients, and the Oath of Vengeance. Now, Devotion, Ancients, and Vengeance were all things in the 2014 Player's Handbook and are pretty much the same. That said, they have seen some significant changes into some of their early... Well, let's see. They're the same in terms of their flavor, but in terms of their mechanical execution, they're all a little bit different. The Oath of Glory has been reprinted out of Tasha's and has a few kind of minor changes, but generally speaking, all of the classes have had a lot of nice quality of life buffs, in particular with their action economy. With your subclass, you're going to get your subclass spell list. At this point, you'll get 2 first level spells always prepared, and you'll also get some unique way with your subclass to use your channel divinity. Now, all subclasses used to offer 2 channel divinity options, but now you're only going to get 1, and this is going to be important when you're looking to adapt an older Paladin subclass. The channel divinity that you should pick should not be the one that's kind of like an abjure enemies or turn undead and that kind of thing. It should be the other one because of a class feature Paladins are going to get later. Moving on to level 4, Paladins get their first ability score improvement or feat, and they follow the normal feat schedule, so we'll get another one at levels 8, 12, 16, and 19. And there are no changes here. One of the big things about feats with Paladins is that Paladins are always challenged to choose between boosting their attack stat and getting weapon feats, or getting charisma feats to boost their spells and some of their other class features. This is a little bit easier now to kind of pick your feats, thanks to the fact that general feats all come with at least some kind of stat increase, but it still is difficult because you're stretched between 2 different stats. Moving on to level 5, Paladins get extra attack, like all marshals. Well, pretty much all marshals, and they can attack twice instead of once when they take the attack action on their turn. And they get this new feature called Faithful Steed, which says that they get the Find Steed spell always prepared, and they can cast it without spending a spell slot once per long rest. Now, Find Steed is a spell that was introduced in Xanathar. It is a really nice spell, and it's been ported over into the new Player's Handbook. It also has the Find Greater Steed kind of built in as an upcast to it. So if you cast the Find Steed spell at level 4 or more, you'll basically get what was the Find Greater Steed spell, which it can fly and that kind of thing. This is also the point where Paladins get 2nd level spells and their 2nd level subclass spells. So this is a pretty darn big power spike level for Paladins. And, you know, one of the new there is a new smite spell called Shining Smite that's pretty good. It can give you advantage and that kind of thing on demand. Yeah. Now, moving on to level 6, Paladins get Aura of Protection. So this says that we radiate an aura in a 10-foot emanation that originates from you. It's inactive while you're incapacitated. And then you and your allies who are in the aura get a bonus to all saving throws equal to your charisma modifier, a minimum of +1. And a creature can only benefit from 1 aura of protection at a time. They choose which aura of protection they want to benefit from if there's multiple. So none of this there's only one real mechanical change here. Some of this is just kind of clarification. And that the only change here is that the aura turns off if the Paladin is incapacitated. Now, this class feature is one of the strongest features in the entire game other than features called spellcasting. And this feature is one of the main reasons why a Paladin is probably going to be wanting to bump their charisma, just because of the fact that this feature is so strong defensively, not only for you, but for the entire party. You can still absolutely do an offensive Paladin, and I think the level where you need to up your charisma may not necessarily have to be immediately, but there are ways, again, that Paladins can solve that multiple attribute dependence and be able to go all in on charisma. All right, moving on to level 7, Paladins get their subclass feature, and generally speaking, for most subclasses, this is some kind of aura that is going to modify your aura of protection and add another bonus to it. And every subclass I've looked at pretty much has something that modifies their aura, other than one, and that one is Oath of Vengeance. They have something else, but for the most part, most subclasses are going to have something that changes your aura of protection and makes it better in some way. Moving on to level 8 is our second ability score, improvement or feat. No changes here, and the multiple attribute dependent conundrum, do I pick my attack stat, do I pick my charisma, continues. Moving on to level 9, Paladins get a new feature here called Abjure Foes. So this takes a magic action to activate. You'll spend a Channel Divinity charge, and a number of creatures up to your Charisma modifier within 60 feet of you have to make a Wisdom save. This is going to be against your spell save DC, or they'll be frightened of you for 1 minute or until they take damage. And while they're frightened of you in this way, they can only do one of the following on their turn. They can choose to move, take an action, or take a bonus action. Now, this is a very, very strong control ability, especially if you're not going to be damaging the enemies. It is save or suck, so if they fail the initial save, they get no further save until they're damaged or until 1 minute passes. And in addition to the fear effect, which will make it so they can't move closer to you, they'll have disadvantage on attacks and ability checks while you're in their line of sight. They also, they basically have this condition where their action economy is very limited. So this is a potential very powerful thing, and this is, again, another reason why you might want to boost your charisma. Level 9 is also the level where Paladins get 3rd level spells, which are generally speaking pretty darn impactful. The subclass spells at this level are usually very good as well. Moving on to level 10, Paladins get Aura of Courage, and this says you and your allies have immunity to the frightened condition while they're in your Aura of Protection, and if a frightened ally enters the aura, that condition has no effect while that ally is there. So it doesn't get rid of it, but it just suppresses it. The only real change here is that they bolted this into Aura of Protection. Before, it used to be its own kind of aura, so it's not like that anymore. Additionally, adding it into Aura of Protection means that if you get incapacitated, your Aura of Courage also turns off, which does make sense. Moving on to level 11, we get a 3rd Channel Divinity charge, which is actually a big deal. Makes that Abjure Foes even easier to use. And we get Radiant Strikes. This is basically improved Divine Smite, but it's been reworded and renamed a little bit. So this says that when we hit a target with an attack roll with a melee weapon or an unarmed strike, the target takes an extra 1d8 radiant damage. The only real change here is that they allowed it to work with unarmed strikes before it required a melee weapon attack. This is one of those things that makes the Archer Paladin not happy if you're going up to this level. If you're doing a campaign that is, say level 10 or lower, an Archer Paladin can actually work pretty darn well. But if you're going to be going up this high and getting this feature, it won't work for you. So yeah, I wouldn't do an Archer Paladin in a higher level campaign. Moving on to level 12, we are at ability score improvement number 3 and nothing else. As we've seen in the last kind of several class videos, level 12 again seems to be a universally sucky level. It's basically just a feat and nothing else for pretty much everybody across the board. Now at this point you should have a capped stat, either your attack stat, your strength or dexterity, or your charisma. Either you might have it before this feat, you might have it after this feat, but assuming that you've taken all those feats to cap that stat, your future one should be able to boost your other one. So potentially a higher level Paladin is going to be able to start pumping their charisma or making their weapon attacks better. Moving on to level 13, it is just 4th level spells here, both from the core class and the subclass spells. A notable thing here is you can now upcast Find Steed to get a flying mount. One of the cool things about Find Steed is if you cast it on a previous day, you don't have to spend any resources to refresh it, so you probably will have a permanent flying mount at this point as a Paladin. I do like that they made the mount a core Paladin thing, but at the same time, there's this problem with the spell where it's not always possible to use a mount. If you're going into a dungeon, I kind of doubt you're going to be able to use it, and yeah, so having the mount is nice, but again, you're not always going to be able to use it. Moving on to level 14, Paladins get Restoring Touch, and this is a rework of the Cleansing Touch feature. So what it says now is when we use our Lay on Hands on a creature, we can also remove one or more of the following conditions from it. We can remove blinded, charmed, deafened, frightened, paralyzed, or stunned. Now it costs 5 points of your pool per condition that you remove, and those points don't heal the creature. And remember, we can also remove poison because that was part of the base Lay on Hands. We can also potentially heal someone at the same time as removing a condition. So let's say we spent 6 points, we could remove one of these conditions and heal them for 1, and that kind of thing. Now, before it used to take a full action and it just used to remove the effects of a spell. So again, it's a bonus action now because it's part of Lay on Hands, so that's great. And I think, in my opinion, the ability to remove conditions is probably better than the ability to remove a spell, especially given that a lot of conditions applied by monster abilities are not ones applied by spells. So I would say that this is a buff. Moving on to level 15, we get a subclass feature. Now, the features across the classes, there isn't really a general theme across all the classes of what they get here, like there was at level 7, where it's usually something to do with your aura of protection, but the abilities here are generally pretty strong and kind of tie into the subclass themes. Moving on to level 16, it is our 4th ability score improvement or feat. No changes here. We don't get any new spells here, so this is kind of like level 12 in that it's only a feat. Moving on to level 17, Paladins are up to 5th level spells. There's some pretty powerful ones here, both on the main class and the spell and the subclass lists. Although, waiting until level 17 to get 5th level spells, other classes have had them for 8, 9 levels at this point. So that's half cashers for you, though. Moving on to level 18, Paladins get a feature called Aura Expansion that says Aura of Protection is now a 30-foot emanation. Now, importantly, there are no changes here. This feature, all of the old Aura features used to say at level 18 it expands to 30 feet. So there's no actual changes mechanically, but it's been codified into a feature here at Paladin 18, specifically, in my opinion, for clarity. Moving on to level 19, it's Paladin's 5th and final ability score improvement or feat, and as a level 19 character, if you were pure class, you could take an epic boon feat here. No changes here. This is when you get your final 5th level spell slot, by the way. And then at level 20, it is the capstone of the class, which pretty uniquely for Paladins among classes, it's tied into your subclass. Now, the way this works, usually these capstone subclass features are some kind of very powerful transformation or ascension type effect. You can use it once per long rest for free, and then you can spend a 5th level slot to recharge it thereafter. And this is something that has been added by the 2024 rules. So you could potentially use your kind of class capstone 3 times per long rest based on the spell slots that you have here. Usually these things don't take a full action to activate. Usually they take a bonus action, but sometimes it's an action. So it kind of varies from subclass to subclass in terms of what these do. But usually they're very powerful and kind of tie into the subclass themes as a whole. All right, so now that we're through all of the class features, let's talk about multiclassing the Paladin. So the minimum requirements you need to take a level outside of Paladin or take a level in Paladin if it's not your first class is you need 13 strength and 13 charisma. The proficiencies that you'll get if it's not your first class, you'll get proficiency in light and medium armor, notably not heavy armor. You'll also get shield proficiency and proficiency with simple and martial weapons. Additionally, Paladins now count towards your overall multi-class caster level as your Paladin level over 2 rounded up. This is largely due to the fact that we get spells now at level 1. And this used to be, your level over 2 rounded down, and that's actually a big deal. This means that if you're playing something like, say, a sorcerer and you want to dip into Paladin to get armor and shields, it doesn't actually cost you anything towards your overall spell slot progression, although the level of spells will be delayed by a level. So, in my opinion, what does Paladin go best with? And I think it goes best with Bard, Sorcerer, and Warlock. Not particularly in that order, but these are the other 3 charisma-based classes, and these are probably the most powerful, most obvious synergies. All 3 of these classes can potentially use the armor, shields, and weapon masteries from a Paladin dip, like we just talked about. Especially if it's at level 1, you can get heavy armor that way, and then you won't have to have anything in dexterity. A Paladin also, much like in the 2014 rules, can transition into Bard or Sorcerer, another charisma caster, basically after Paladin 6, and you get your aura to become a better caster. Additionally, a single level of Warlock now gives you an access to a new invocation called Pact of the Blade. Yes, all of the pacts are invocations now, and the new Pact of the Blade lets you make attacks with your pact weapon using your charisma instead of your strength or dexterity. So a single level of Warlock here can work very well and will potentially solve your multiple ability score dependence just because of Pact of the Blade, and you can go further in Warlock if you want. Now, Paladins can also work with Fighter. A more martial-focused Paladin can pick up some nice features from Fighter like Action Surge, Second Wind, Tactical Mind, and a subclass, something like Battlemaster, for example. Or even Eldritch Knight if you want some kind of abjuration spells, although in my opinion, if you want those, you're better off going with Sorcerer. This character would probably need to be a strength primary character due to the multi-class requirements. That said, for a pure class fighter, if you're not Eldritch Knight, I probably don't see you dipping Paladin. Notably, I used to have Barbarian on this also works list. However, because of the changes to Divine Smite and the fact that it's a spell now, that means you can't use it with Rage, which means the Barbarian multiclass is out. An important thing to note, if you do go with Pact of the Blade and want to do that single attribute dependence on Charisma, you do also have to weigh the fact that none of the Charisma general feats help your weapon attacks. So things that you might want like Great Weapon Master or Polearm Master or Dual Wielder, that kind of thing, those will boost your strength or maybe your dexterity if you're going to go with that dex dual wielder. And so you might only be able to take one of those and take other things in charisma. So it's definitely a trade-off of whether you want to be better with weapons or better with your aura and with spells. All right. So another thing here, other classes can work with Paladin if you have the stats for it, but this is usually only possible with well-rolled stats. It's very difficult to use Paladin with other classes, mainly due to the stat requirements, due to strength, charisma, and then whatever your other class is going to need. It might be intelligence for a wizard, it could be wisdom for a cleric. If you want to do ranger, very bad, very difficult because you need 13 strength, 13 dex, 13 wisdom, and 13 charisma. I have done builds that have done this in the past under the 2014 rules, but the things that use Paladin that aren't bard, sorcerer, warlock, or fighter are very, very specific and very niche. All right, moving on to our summary and ratings. So here is what I gave the Paladin in all the 6 categories I look at under the 2014 rules. So we're going to be looking at offense, defense, control, support, skills, and complexity. So first up is offense, and I'm still giving the Paladin a 4-star rating. Now, allow me to explain. So their offense was both buffed and nerfed. The most obvious nerf is that, the Divine Smite feature was cut and made into a spell that now requires action economy. So the Nova potential of Paladins has definitely been cut, and I don't want to disregard that. But that said, if you went Nova on a Paladin, you would burn through your spell slots really quickly. The total number of spell slots available to a Paladin hasn't actually changed, and you actually basically get an extra first level spell slot you can use with Divine Smite thanks to the Paladin Smite feature. And additionally, the smites themselves, in my opinion, have gotten better for the most part. Even though they take some action economy to use now. The Paladins also got masteries, and the feats that the Paladins want also grant stats now instead of basically doing nothing. So all of this, in my opinion, comes down to a net wash. I think Paladins are actually great offensively, and that hasn't changed, especially if you were only smiting on crits anyways. The changes basically encourage you to use your spell slots consistently and spread your damage out over an encounter rather than front-loading it. Now, again, front-loading damage is very valuable, and I don't want to discount that. But I think overall, the offensive potential of the Paladin, even though things have been reworked, I think the sum of the parts is still roughly about the same. All right, moving on to defense, and I give the Paladin a 4 out of 5, which is the same as I gave them in 2014. Paladins just have an amazing defense, and that didn't really change. They get heavy armor, so they're going to have a high armor class. They're going to have great saves thanks to Aura of Protection. They've got self-healing with Lay on Hands and kind of some warding and healing and buff spells. And by the way, Lay on Hands is a bonus action now, so healing yourself doesn't necessarily interfere with your action economy. If you want to make this even better, you could add in something like Magic Initiate Wizard or any other way to get kind of reaction spells, and I think the Paladin probably has a perfect defensive suite at that point. I'm honestly tempted to 5-star this just because of bonus action lay on hands, but I think the lack of reaction spells in the core class is enough to keep the core class at a 4-star rating. All right, next up is Control. I gave them a 3-star in 2014, and I'm going to give them a 3-star again now. However, I think the Paladin's Control is arguably better now thanks to the Abjure Foes feature, which is really good. Weapon masteries, as well as a lot of the new smites. They don't require concentration, and you can apply fear and knock enemies back and that kind of thing. However, I don't think it's enough. These buffs are enough to warrant 4 stars. They don't really have those super high impact, high level control spells for the most part. So I would give this, honestly, it's probably a 3.5 or a 3+, but I don't think it's enough to qualify as a 4, but it is better than it was in 2014. Moving on to support, this is a Paladin's ability to kind of help and support their allies, and I think I give them a 3 stars before. I'm going to give them 3 stars again. Their healing and warding abilities, honestly, I think are better. Lay on Hands is a bonus action now, which is great. Cleansing Touch in that is a bonus action, and I think it's a lot easier to use. Well, I think it's Restoring Touch now, but what was Cleansing Touch is now Restoring Touch. It's a lot easier to use. It can remove a whole bunch of nasty conditions. So this is a fantastic improvement, but once again, I don't think it's enough to bump it up to 4 stars. I think this is either 3.5 or a 3+. Moving on to skills, this is kind of their ability to support in kind of skill-based challenges. I gave them a 1 in 2014, which is the lowest I will give. I'm not going to give anybody a 0. And I'm going to give them a 1 again. Paladins don't really have any abilities other than really rolling the dice that allow them to contribute on the skill front, at least in the core class. They can potentially fill a few roles or be a backup in a specific role due to the way they might allocate their stats and proficiencies, but that isn't really anything special and doesn't really warrant anything more than a 1, in my opinion. And finally, Complexity, and I gave them a 3-star in 2014, and I'm giving them a 3-star again. So Complexity is a measure of how difficult the class is to play. So a 5-star Complexity rating is a class that's very difficult, and a 1-star is going to be a class that's very easy. And the difficulty here is it's how difficult it is to play, and is mainly related to how many choices there are and how difficult those choices are. So Paladin is one of the more complex kind of martial characters. They got a whole bunch of bonus actions now. You have the whole feat choice challenge of, do I boost my attack stat or do I boost my charisma? You're also a half caster, so you have some casting abilities, some martial abilities. So on a given turn, is it better to cast a spell or do something like Abjure Foes or make attacks? Also, due to being a half caster, they don't actually have that many spell slots, so resource management is a potential big concern. However, all that said, there's a wide variety of effective styles, and due to the kind of strength of the core class in offense and defense, it's kind of hard to get a Paladin wrong, in my opinion. And for the most part, unless you dump your charisma or something, your Paladin's probably going to be pretty darn effective, even if you don't necessarily make perfect choices. All right, so thanks for watching. This has been our overview on Paladin. I think as a whole, Paladin is a lot better now. Well, not a lot better. I think the Paladins I think they're better than they were in 2014, even though smiting was nerfed. They've seen buffs in other areas, and I think the nerf to smites is really just something that's going to focus them to shift their playstyle a little bit. I think mechanically they're still very strong and one of the better classes in the game. I think the subclass reworks to all the core Player's Handbook classes were great and necessary. They're also significant and help free up a lot of action economy on those. And as a whole, Challenge Divinity, I think, feels a lot better as a resource. Additionally, the reworks to general feats to always include stats helped Paladin a lot. Paladin is one of those stat-hungry classes, much like Monk that we did in the last video, and yeah, those things helped them a lot. Now our next one is going to be on Sorcerer. Now I have been going through these classes alphabetically, which would have meant that Ranger is going to be next, but Sorcerer has been requested by some viewers. So once again, my name is Nathan. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this overview on Paladins, and I will see you next time.